Dichotomous keys are tools used by scientists to identify living and non-living things. In this video, we're going to look at the steps that we can use to create our own dichotomous key to identify a group of living organisms. Some dichotomous keys are organised into lists of questions. This one here has a series of paired questions to help us identify different types of fish. Some dichotomous keys look like charts. This one has a series of yes or no questions that helps us to identify the living creatures. But how do we make our own dichotomous key? The first thing we need to start with is a group of specimens. Here I have 6 living things: a snake, a lizard, a tortoise, a spider, an ant, and a bat. To begin to be able to make a dichotomous key, we need to create a list of the observable physical traits of these organisms. Things like number of legs. Is there an exoskeleton? Does it have a backbone? Does it have wings? Does it have scales? Does it have fur? Or does it have antennae? Once you have written down as many of the observable traits as you can for each of these organisms, you need to pick one of the traits to be able to divide the group into 2 smaller groups. I'm going to pick the trait of whether it is an invertebrate or a vertebrate animal. These animals, the snake, the lizard, the tortoise, and the bat, are all vertebrate animals. These 2, the spider and the ant, are invertebrates. I can write these 2 options down in step 1 of my dichotomous key. Is the animal an invertebrate, or is it a vertebrate? For step 2, I will need to focus only on the invertebrate animals, my spider and my ant. By looking at these 2 animals, I need to choose another feature that I can use to separate them further. The most obvious one for me is the number of legs. The spider has 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, while the ant has 6, 2, 4, 6. I can use these 2 options to be able to identify these 2 creatures on my key. I'll write it in step 2 like this. Does the animal have 8 legs? It must be my spider. Or does it have 6 legs? Then it will be my ant. At this stage, I've identified these 2 animals and I don't need to consider them further on my dichotomous key. I now need to go back and look at those vertebrate animals so that we can separate them down into their individual groups. So I have left my snake, my lizard, my tortoise, and my bat. I will need to choose a trait from my list that I can use to further separate these ones. I'm going to choose the trait of scaly skin because I know the snake, the lizard, and the tortoise all have scaly skin. I'll write this in step 3. Does the animal have scales? Go to question 4. Or if it doesn't have scales, then it must be our bat. Now the bat has been identified from my list of animals, and I don't need to worry about it anymore. I have 3 animals left. What trait can we use to distinguish between my snake, my lizard, and my tortoise? For step 4, I'm going to focus on the number of legs. If it has legs, we need to continue on to question 5. But if the specimen has no legs, then it must be our snake, and that removes it from our series of questions. Finally, this leaves me with just the lizard and the tortoise. Both of them are reptiles, and both of them have 4 legs. I will have to use something else to distinguish them, so I'm going to choose the presence or absence of a shell. If the animal has a shell, it is our tortoise, and if it doesn't have a shell, it's our lizard, and I would write it like this. We've now managed to identify all the specimens on our original list. Our completed key will look like this, our series of paired questions to help us identify each of those organisms based on their observable traits. We will need to go back and add in the second part of our first step. The vertebrate animals, we need to add this part in here so that we know if it is a vertebrate, we move on to step 3. So let's just run through our key. If the animal is an invertebrate, we go to question 2, and that will identify our spider and our ant. If the animal is a vertebrate animal, then we need to go on to step 3, 4 and 5, because that will identify our remaining organisms. Since there are many traits that you could use to group these animals, there's more than one way to create a dichotomous key. Your dichotomous key may be completely different to mine, depending on the traits that you've chosen to include. What it means is that there is more than one correct answer to be able to identify these animals. So let's go back over those steps. Firstly, when making a dichotomous key, you need to look at your specimens and create a list of all the physical traits that you can observe. You then need to choose one trait that will divide the group specimens into 2 broad groups. This trait will be written as a 2-option question so that we can separate them. You then look at one of the new groups of specimens and choose a second trait to further divide them into smaller groups. You continue with these steps until all the organisms from that group have been named. You can then go back and repeat the steps with the second group of specimens until each organism is identified. Now it's your turn to try. Collect some living specimens and try and create your own dichotomous key based on the observable physical traits of each of those living creatures.